God is dead, he remains dead, and we have killed him. This quote by Friedrich Nietzsche is both powerful and controversial. In this documentary, we will take a closer look at its meaning and how it has defined Nietzsche as a philosopher. But first, who is Friedrich Nietzsche? Nietzsche was a German philosopher born on October 15, 1844, and died August 25, 1900. Throughout his 56 years, he wrote many books and thought of ideas many poets, philosophers, playwrights, and more are still looking at today. However, throughout those ideas, there are many misconceptions and debates over what he really thought. One such debate that I'll be talking about the most is whether or not Nietzsche was a nihilist. To understand the idea of nihilism, one must first open their mind to both its simplicity and its complexity. In simple terms, a nihilist is someone who doesn't believe in any meaning to life, but the complex side is radical and often viewed as pessimism. A nihilist believes that all values are baseless and that there's nothing that can be defined as meaning, rejecting all moral and religious principles. If a person subscribes to nihilism, he or she would believe in nothing. This person would have no loyalties or purpose. Looking back at the aforementioned quote by Nietzsche, God is dead, he remains dead, and we have killed him, we can only assume that Nietzsche is in fact a nihilist. But was he? His beliefs are often misunderstood. We will see the truth behind Nietzsche's philosophies and why he does not, in fact, subscribe to the ideas of nihilism. Before we get into Nietzsche's philosophies, let's look into his life to better understand him. He was born in Aachen, Prussia. After the death of his father at an early age, his family moved to Naumburg, Germany. When he graduated, he went to the University of Bonn to study theology and classic philology. In 1869, a job opportunity opened up for classic philology in Basel. He managed to get this job as a professor without completing a doctoral thesis or an additional dissertation. Later in his life, he became seriously ill, half-blind, and was practically always in pain. Throughout 1879 and 1889, Nietzsche had a decade of isolation and creativity. He wrote many books in this time, notably Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Ecce Homo, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morals. Later, in January of 1889, Nietzsche collapsed in the streets of Turin. He lost all control of his mind and spent the next 11 years of his life in an asylum with complete mental darkness. He died in 1900 of syphilis. As mentioned earlier, Nietzsche is commonly thought of as a nihilist. One thing that is very important to know is that he was also known for coining the term overman, which to him meant the perfect person. To be that perfect person, he thought one would rise above traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs. In other words, the overman to him is the evolution of humanity. It would be the next step in the human race, or at least he believed the overman would create their own values. He thought they would do this without using traditional beliefs to guide them, so that the laws of those beliefs could help them determine their own values. This concept is one of the reasons why people think that Nietzsche was a nihilist, because, as you can see, both terms have similar contexts, and so a misconception could easily be made. One of Nietzsche's most important books, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, tells the story of Zarathustra, but a new Zarathustra, the Iranian prophet who influenced Judeo-Christian beliefs, and who, in Nietzsche's fictional version, was fit to preach the bringing down of the dualistic beliefs that he helped create. The book starts by introducing Zarathustra, who has been living in the mountains for 10 years. He comes down to share what he has learned. As he's going down the mountains, he meets, as Nietzsche calls it, an old saint. The saint exclaims how he had grown tired of the flaws of humanity and now only loves God. Zarathustra hears this and exclaims, "Could it be possible? This old saint has not heard in this forest that God is dead." This quote introduces the concept of the death of God. However, it does not necessarily mean that the God from the Judeo-Christian religion is in fact deceased, not real or fake, but instead that people are losing the beliefs in it. Later in the story, Zarathustra starts preaching the Overman, or in German, the Übermensch. Man is something to overcome. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and Overman, a rope over an abyss. This quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra demonstrates that Nietzsche didn't see humanity as being complete. Rather, he thought of people being on a path, walking towards the Overman. Nietzsche put down an example for this, saying that we are like a tightrope walker over an abyss. We are balancing on a path from animal to Overman. But how does this relate to people thinking that he is a nihilist? On the path to becoming the Overman, nihilism is an inevitable part of the journey. Just because it is a part of the path, that does not mean he believed in nihilistic views. He did, however, believe that humanity would lose traditional beliefs and transition to a nihilistic ideology. Because of this new belief in nothing, it would leave people distraught. So as a solution, he thought up the idea of the Overman, someone who is like a nihilist in the sense that there is no correct meaning to life. However, contrasted from nihilism, they develop a meaning without using traditional beliefs. This is often confused with nihilism. They don't believe in anything, literally. But the key difference is that they don't throw away the idea of giving life meaning. Instead of having a set meaning to life, whether that to be to get into a place after death or something else, they create their own meaning. So overall, nihilism is often confused with the idea of the overman because they both don't believe in objective meaning to life, but they do, however, have a meaning to life. Because Nietzsche used the term nihilism and introduced the idea that nihilism is one of the most important things in humanity, many became confused and favored to use talking about how nihilism as the end goal, because the overman is so similar to a nihilist. To put that into perspective, Nietzsche described nihilism as part of a path similarly to how being a child is part of growing up. The death of God is often misconceived as being a statement to lean towards a nihilistic path. This is, however, again, not true. Nietzsche was saying that the death of God allowed for nihilism to happen, but that does not mean he was a nihilist. To prove this, we can look at another one of Nietzsche's writings, The Parable of the Madman, a short story widely known when talking about the death of God. To summarize this, it tells of a madman who cries out to a town of atheists, yelling, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." The townsfolk laugh and yell back, asking if he's lost like a child. The madman calls them murderers, and how they are going to comfort themselves. He then proclaims that he has come too early, and people won't see the effects of the death of God for thousands of years. He explains to the people that it will require time for them to realize the murder they have committed, and the effects of such deaths are still more distant than the most distant stars. Nietzsche claims that the people committed the heinous crime of killing God, yet they have no idea how they have done this. There is no physical act, so how could this be possible? This is because when he talks about the murder, he is speaking about it in a metaphorical sense. Or in other words, Nietzsche never directly says that Christianity or any other religion is true or false. Instead, when he discusses the death of God, he does not talk about someone dying. Instead, the belief in God is dying, or just the belief into the Judeo-tradition as a whole is dying out. That is why the madman is proclaiming the death of God. How does this relate to the initial claim? Nietzsche was saying that the death of God allowed for nihilism to happen, but that does not mean he was a nihilist. He wanted something more than nihilism, and the parable of the madman does not summarize his full idea of this. Instead, it demonstrates just the thought of the death of God. This is why it is often misconceived as him being nihilistic.
He wanted us to understand that there was no transcendent source of values, and that we had to determine our own.
This quote by Les Miller, an associate professor of philosophy at Colorado Mesa University, substantiates that Nietzsche was not a nihilist. In interviewing Dr. Miller, the case against Nietzsche becomes very clear. In fact, Miller pointed out Nietzsche's purpose wasn't to convert people to nihilism. Rather, Nietzsche believed that there was no superior values, no source that is above all else, and that we need to create our own values and not be influenced by something or someone telling us what our values should be. Nietzsche described the Judeo-Christian tradition as devious. However, according to Miller, his reasons for feeling this negativity come from the life he was living.
The way he describes it comes from his own affinity for certain virtues: strength, nobility, heroism, fortitude, sorts of things he actually didn't really have in life, being so sickly. So he saw Christianity as turning those virtues into vices, and turning the vices of meekness and so on into virtues.
It doesn't mean Nietzsche is claiming that Christianity wasn't true. He just did not agree with the values and so described it as devious and the opposite of what Roman paganism believed in. This ultimately would leave the world believing he was a nihilist, but in reality, he simply wanted the people to establish their values independently without influence from Judeo-Christian beliefs that he found to be devious. In summary, Nietzsche had many ideas that don't lean far off the path of nihilism. However, that does not mean he was a nihilist. His influential ideas are often misconceived as being nihilistic because of his highly controversial statement, "God is dead," a phrase demonstrating the loss of traditional beliefs, rather than common misconception of physical death. In addition, the overman highly resembles the traits of a nihilistic person, but differs in the overman has a need to create meaning where a nihilist does not. Lastly, Nietzsche's writings, namely Parable of the Madman and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. They introduce ideas that can be confused with nihilism, such as the death of God. Because this statement is often misunderstood as a literal God dying, in Nietzsche's example, the death of God is merely talking about the loss of belief in God. These differences, as well as a testimony from Dr. Les Miller, professor of philosophy, probably proves that the claim of Nietzsche as a nihilist is a misconception.